I'd like to introduce Mark Graham from PwC. I think he has his PowerPoint, the first PowerPoint of the day, so you haven't been too overwhelmed by PowerPoints, but it's time for one, I think, don't you? And Mark is going to talk about different aspects of social impact and the issues around measurement. I then might say a few words about my findings from institutional investors we spoke to, and then we very much want it to be a question of discussion with everybody. So over to Mark first.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Katie. I'm an economist with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Over the last 2 years, I've been working with the private sector, government and social enterprises in the measurement of social impacts. My exam question set by ClearlySo was, what can social enterprises learn from the private sector and government? In short, what are they interested in? Why are they interested in measuring, and what opportunities are presented to social enterprises? So to be helpful and to reflect the different trends that certainly I'm seeing within the private and the public spheres, I've split my presentation into two. So turning first of all to the private sector, I'm going to let you read that for a few seconds. Whenever I do a presentation on the private sector, I always start off with that quote. There's various reasons for that. I think the first one is that certainly the potential of the private sector to change the world, hopefully for the right reasons, is quite significant. I think secondly, in the context of looking at social enterprises, social impacts, just imagine a statement in 5-10 years about the ability of a private sector to influence and have a positive effect on communities. Now, this is a very messy diagram, but it's one, again, that we've used with the private sector, and there seems to be some degree of resonance. It's trying to put the usual thing of trying to put something on a page which says, okay, you as an organization, private sector organization, what influence and impact do you have on your marketplace, on your supply chain, on your community, on the countries that you operate? And let's try and disentangle all of that, because you do have, if you believe it or not, a significant influence at all of those different levels. So if you look at the inputs and outputs, it's about breaking up into digestible form, both in terms of the influence you may have and the influence public policy will have on your operations. Similarly, looking at social investment and your philanthropic view of life, but also looking at the core of what your business does. And the one thing that everybody gets is that they're all interlinked. So that's the point about the middle diagram. What you do does not stop at the factory gate. You have a significant influence both in terms of your market, your supply chain, the communities within which you operate, and ergo public policy on a local, regional, national, and global basis. And I think the key point about this is then saying, well, how do we translate that into measurable outcomes, numbers? Business loves numbers because they can use the numbers in different ways to understand what they're doing and what impacts they're having. Now, the way that we've been looking at this with some of our clients is splitting it down into those 5/6 categories. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each category. I'll just pick up specific examples. If you look at the supply chain, a lot of global companies say that they have policies in relation to supply chains. Well, do they? And what impacts do they have? And one of our clients had actually looked at their supply chain. They'd looked particularly in Vietnam. They'd found below the first tier there was significant negative social impact in terms of their supply chain. And they wanted to change that. And they wanted to look at different approaches to change that, that particular supply chain. Similarly, there was another organization that was being pushed by particular governments in Africa about paying more tax. Actually, they were, for commercial reasons, running one of the best AIDS programs in Africa. And they'd never valued that, and they'd never actually looked at what the implications of that were on communities. So again, that became a component part of demonstrating to government that actually they were generating social impact, and was part of discussions around that. So I guess that's the framework against which private sector is or may be going to be looking at the effect of its operations at different levels and using different measures. Now, when I say measures and messages, what do I actually mean? Well, you may not be too comfortable with the total tax contribution, but at least it's a contribution that goes into public sector that can be used for good works. Similarly, I think everybody's comfortable about actually disentangling what the economic benefits might be of any given operation, whether it be private, whether it be social enterprise. Looking at social impacts, and again, the way that Katie posed it to me was, well, you should be looking at this bottom up. What can social enterprises do for private sector companies of a certain nature or size? There's an expression in our firm which is, look at yourself in your client's shoes, put yourself in their shoes. So I think from your perspective, it's a case of understanding what are the types of metrics that they are using around social impacts. Now, whether that be health and safety, working conditions, empowerment, and so on, and what you can offer as a proposition around those areas. Similarly in terms of environment and certainly in terms of transparency and development, things like Millennium Development Goals. But I think the critical point about this is the messages. Why would firms do this? And the first one is commercial. It's absolutely hard-nosed commercial. If you can provide within your supply chain better outcomes, better efficiency, and actually have government not look at you in certain ways, that is commercially of benefit. Similarly, reputationally, it's of great benefit that you are demonstrating to your consumers that you are taking this element of your impact seriously and are able to measure that impact. I think there's the element also of disclosure, and disclosure means not just good impacts, it also means bad impacts. It doesn't mean a large number. It means that you are going to act on and take seriously. So again, one of the companies we've been working with on the environmental side is Puma, and you may have seen their public pronouncements about putting their negative environmental impacts on their balance sheet and P&L. Now, the reason they're doing that is from a baseline position. How are we going to change unless we know that baseline position? And similarly, by disclosing this and saying we want to make it better, then again, in terms of that impact it may have on their positioning. Again, advocacy, lobbying, funding and partnerships, again, within the UK, and I'm going to come on to that from the public sector. And I guess, finally, this point about reputation. Now, take it or leave it. I know there's quite a lot of philosophical issues around this, but in terms of observing what private sector companies are doing or are likely to do in the future, and then looking at how you can help them achieve better outcomes is the message that I'd like to leave you with in terms of the private sector. Right, moving on to the public sector. This is very much UK. I'm glad that Social Finance asked the question around the use of social impacts. There is a trend, again, whether it will actually gain any momentum, I don't know, but there certainly is a trend to look towards payment by results, and payment by results to address social issues and social needs. I was interested this morning to see one of the items on the BBC was payment by results for Doncaster Jail, and clearly there is Peterborough Jail too in terms of trying to reduce reconviction. I think the precepts are quite interesting because payment by results is not going to be a panacea, and it's not going to be pervasive across government, because I think there are certain conditions that have and need to be met. First of all, there's identified social need or an unmet need. So whether that's prisons, whether it's unemployment, whether it's bullying, whether it's all of those different aspects that are not at this moment being fully addressed. Again, it's the view, certainly a precept and a view of government that there's, you've actually got to have either providers or the potential for organisations out there to be able to deliver better outcomes. So whether we're talking about early intervention, whether we're talking about bringing in people into prisons that have not been brought into prisons, and so on and so forth, but it's the potential to deliver better outcomes. And then HM Treasury enters the picture and says, okay, it's not just about better outcomes, it's about cashable savings. We can't enter into this process unless we can demonstrate and identify where the public exchequer is reducing costs. And again, that's quite a key component of this process. Got to be value for money outcomes compared to alternatives. And in the current context, there ain't no money from the public sector. So it's about bringing in either providers who have deep pockets that can have the working capital access before they get paid, or it's about bringing in social investors, and it was very intriguing the last presentation. And the issue is trying to bring all of those together so that the social investors will actually get paid by the results that the providers deliver because of this cashable savings that Treasury can identify and measure. And then finally, and I know, well, maybe not all of you have had the pleasure of dealing with EU procurement law, but you have to find a procurement route to actually be able to do a PBR. Very simple diagram, and I think that tries to explain. It's probably far better than the private sector diagram, which is, in essence, saying we've got to actually bring all of those parties together to make this work. And again, a kind of definition of how we see this potentially going. Now, in terms of metrics and measures, very important, this concept of social impact from a social enterprise point of view. One of the key and critical words in the first metric is net, which means it's not just about gross impacts, not just about telling a story, it's actually saying in the absence of what you would do or what you're proposing to do, what would happen anyway. And government is very keen to understand what the net additional impact of what you're proposing is. We do not operate in a vacuum, and they will look at different propositions. So it's around the net impact. Similarly, it's around actually looking at, from the governments, if that's the demand side, actually saying, I can provide a better service outcome than currently is being provided. From the supply side, i.e. the government side, it's, well, what's in it for us? What are, if we can reduce reconviction rates, then why are we paying Serco, if it falls to 59%, a higher rate of return than if it's 62? Because they've worked out that there will be benefit to us as taxpayers, that they, in terms of cashable savings, that they can afford to fund the payment bar results and put a return on it. So it's a point that about cashable savings. Now again, I don't know how many of you have either been involved or taken a view on what's happening around government, but if you look at things like the innovation programme coming out of DWP, if you look at what's coming out of MOJ, if you look at some of the things that are coming out of CLG, sorry, all the acronyms, but they're moving towards a perspective where they're actually going to demand a price, which says, for every unemployed person of a certain type that you can get off the unemployment register, we'll pay you this, because that's how we've worked, that's how we can generate certain cashable savings. It's far more complex than price for issues that are addressing things like families with multiple problems. But in the context of government and in terms of contracting, if you've got a measure of what you think your impact will be, if the government's got a view on how much cash they're going to save, that becomes a discussion point around the contract, the price point. And again, similarly, it becomes in contractual terms very interesting about what you're going to be paid for the first year, the second year, the third year, because, again, there's this recognition that in terms of addressing social issues, quite a few of them, you're not going to turn around over a year, you're not going to turn around over 5 years. It's going to take much longer. So where's the intermediate payments? I guess in terms of social investment, where you're going to get funding, I guess I should have raised this as a question, the degree to which, from an investor's perspective, they are interested in this payment by results, because there are risks here, and the risks are the provider does not deliver, therefore the investor does not get paid, and how you cope with that. And I think finally, and from a kind of economist perspective, but actually far more importantly, I think from this to work, there's got to be objective measures. Everybody's got to be comfortable that if outcomes are delivered, that is a result of provider or providers being involved. So, final messages from me. If it's about social impact, if it's about demonstrating to governments, it's demonstrating that you are better than anything else, and that it's looking at the net impact of what you'll deliver. You have to bear in mind in terms of going to government, and I think government is open to, not persuasion, but certainly there are open doors to going to government and saying, yes, we can deliver better outcomes, and yes, we think we can reduce public exchequer costs as a result. Agreeing bidding for, interesting, won't go into unless you ask questions, but it doesn't take a day. It takes rather longer than a day. Similarly, in terms of convincing investors, and it's around that payment by results and that negotiation with government, convincing government, which isn't always necessarily easy, and it's actually looking at, and it's interesting, and again, it's there are philosophical issues here in terms of political perspectives, but in essence, what's happening here is a contract, and a contract which relates to finance, which relates to returns, which relates to what you can do to change outcomes. And the final issue, and it's one that everybody struggles with, because the mantra, if the banks want to minimize the risk, governments want to minimize the risk. And again, that horrible kind of expression of risk transfer. So there's this mantra of where's the risk being transferred? And again, to be conscious of that and to take a view on it. So that was all I was going to say, and that's all I have said. And I think Katie's going to answer all your questions now. Thank you.
Quite how I understand. No. Thank you very much, Mark. I'd just like to have a few additional comments to make which are relevant to Mark's talk, based on the report that we recently published looking at institutional investors' appetite for getting involved in supporting social enterprises or social investment. Before I do that, would it have been possible to have a raise of hands just to understand a little bit about the potential markets here? Are there organisations represented here who are potentially looking to bid to be involved in supplying the public sector with contracts for services? So about 14, 15. Are there organisations who are also thinking that they will be able to play a part in supporting the private sector, the corporate world, in their delivery of sustainability? Roughly equal. And are any of you thinking of doing both? Good, excellent. Well, that was my first point, actually, was I wanted to say, I think what seems to be emerging is a slight potential danger of division between organisations that feel that they have something very considerable to contribute to public service provision, and those that feel they have a role to play in the private supply chain or corporate sustainability agenda. And my point would be, actually, please keep all the doors open. There's no reason to have to feel that you need to go down one route and not therefore be eligible for the other to really maximise the impact your organisation can make. But I think there are very different requirements, particularly around the impact side. Now, we've just heard from Mark about if you are looking to engage in the public sector, basically to bid to provide services, the measurements you are going to be asked to use, you can see they are demanding. These are commissioners' requirements to show that basically they can save cash from what purchases they will take from you. Now, your agenda then, obviously as an organisation, is very different necessarily to, may well be very different to what the investors felt they were investing in when they put money into your organisation. And we talked a bit earlier in the day about language being a barrier. It seems to me that it's at the impact level, probably more than any other point in the chain of business, that we should be able to make very clear what it is that these organisations can offer. Why is it you should contract with me and not with him? And the reason will be because I can do this and this and this, and that makes an impact. And if we can't talk that language clearly enough for investors, we certainly won't be talking it clearly enough for the corporates to engage or for the public sector to involve you. So I think the issue about public sector can get very muddled. You can get into this issue about showing payment by results on outcomes, muddling that up with real income impact. The government will be looking to say, what cashable savings can we make? Their budgets are so constrained. I mean, if you look in Scotland, for example, you know, if nothing changes in public sector provision, there's going to be £27 billion more demands just on health, social care and justice between now and 2030. And they've got budget cuts of 11%. Well, it doesn't take a magician to work out that the maths of that means we actually have to have considerable change in what we're offering the public sector. So organisations that can really deliver amazing change and prevent more demand being made on the public sector are hugely sought after. And the conversations are open to be had. You know, if you can show you can make a difference because your social innovation is actually driving down demand for the public services, you know, you will be welcomed at the door of public sector. So I really would stress strongly that the more one can be involved in the process of commissioning and what should be put out for commissioning is really important, but also what the agenda is for you as an organisation trying to create impact. And if the two aren't the same thing, you talk the two agendas. On the private sector side, I would say there's a real growing interest, and we heard from the CEO of Kingfisher this morning, there's an enormous interest in trying to engage with social enterprises if, and really only if, they can help them be more resilient as organisations. Now, what do you need to prove to show that is a very different set of criteria, potentially. The criteria will be determined by their own sustainability programmes. And, you know, if you take many of these big companies, it's all written down. Kingfisher had 4 different items. Marks and Spencer's have 140 different targets. All the other big companies, really responsible companies, are looking at this. So there you're looking at what impact can I make if I get involved in the supply chain there. And it's a very different debate. But you can do both. You don't have to be only a private sector or a public sector contractor or provider. And the more intersections we have, the more chance we get some scale. So that was just a few points I wanted to make about potential barriers to the processes. I think we are at a very interesting time. It's a very messy time from the public procurement, but there's so many opportunities to go and knock on the doors and talk to public sector about what you can offer. There really is a desperate need to find some urgent solutions. One, for example, we heard from Fred about the LA Fitness. The costings he had, I mean, this was a marvellous impact figure. Could we all produce figures like this? If the cost of going to a doctor, if you haven't been taking exercise, is £18 for each visit. But if you have, the cost is massively reduced, but the intervention is only 80p. So, you know, it doesn't, it's a very powerful argument to say we must take on more actions that prevent the need for these services. This is the language that will be understood both by the private and the public sector here. So I think we were just hearing a pitch from Bristol Sports, without wanting to prejudice any jury decisions on this. Another example of what we'll be able to show, these figures about the role of exercise and the role of health in preventing further demands is very powerful, and it can be used widely. The report that we looked at found that, in general, the requirements of investors for what they wanted to see as impact measurements were considerably more complex and disparate the more institutional you became. So, for example, individuals were really looking for a story, and they could see that what they were going to invest in had a clear, measurable, obvious output that they understood, an impact that they could grasp. I think foundations also were very comfortable with the storytelling leading the way, and then the evidence of that results. Once we got into the more institutional investors, I found in talking to them a greater degree of uncertainty, really. I think of wanting to sort of cover risks that they might not be backing enterprises that could really deliver something. So they wanted to see a much greater range of metrics, and they wanted cross-benchmarking, they wanted all sorts of comparative abilities, which probably the sector is not yet able to do, and there's an open question whether it ever will be able to. So I think it certainly appears at the moment that the issues around describing impact and measuring impact are most helpfully discussed and move forward with the investors that are at the early stages in this game, who have been here for a while and understand what the agenda really is. And we might then be able to move into the world of institutional investors' impact requirements at a later stage. But I think we still are a long way off understanding exactly what they require.